1 Thessalonians chapter 2. We're going to be reading and working through verses 1 through 12. It's the word of the Lord from 1 Thessalonians chapter 2. For yourselves, brethren, know our entrance in unto you, that it was not in vain, but even after we had suffered before, and were shamefully entreated, as ye know, at Philippi, we were bold in our God to speak unto you the gospel of God with much contention. For our exhortation was not of deceit, nor of uncleanness, nor in guile. But as we were allowed of God to be put in trust with the gospel, even so we speak, not as pleasing men, but God which trieth our hearts. For neither at any time used we flattering words, as ye know, nor a cloak of covetousness, God is witness. Nor of men sought we glory, neither of you, nor yet of others, when we might have been burdensome as the apostles of Christ. But we were gentle among you, even as a nurse cherisheth her children. So being affectionately desirous of you, we were willing to have imparted unto you not the gospel of God only, but also our own souls, because you were dear unto us. For you remember, brethren, our labor and travail, for laboring night and day, because we would not be chargeable unto any of you, we preached unto you the gospel of God. Ye are witnesses, and God also, how holily and justly and unblameably we behaved ourselves among you that believe. As ye know how we exhorted and comforted and charged every one of you as a father doth his children, that ye would walk worthy of God, who hath called you unto his kingdom and glory. This is the word of the Lord.
Thank you, God.
So chapter 2 of this first letter to the Thessalonians opens with Paul reminding this church of the nature of his ministry while he was with them. Remember from Acts 17, we read a portion of that last week, we learned the span of Paul's original time with them, right, when he first ministered unto them. 3 Sabbaths in a row, Paul reasoned with the Thessalonians, and 3 successive weeks he spent himself ministering unto them, unto their needs. You know, you may have had an experience in the past where you spent a short amount of time with someone, or another Christian, but that time was almost instantly significant and impactful for you because of a mutual love for Christ between the two of you, and therefore a conversation of actual substance, true substance. So that was a great blessing to you. Those blessed relationships in life, when they come, are a glimpse into what the Thessalonians experienced. I say a glimpse because the Apostle Paul shines as an example to all believers of how to lay down your life for another, how to lay down yourself in service to other believers. He's a man not matched probably by anyone after him. And this heart of service, a heart set on honoring God and loving his people to the utmost, is what set Paul apart as an exemplary minister. But it is to mark the life of every minister. God's men must fear God, and they must not allow themselves in their lives to be distracted from preaching the word of God. They cannot be distracted from themselves, and they cannot live in a way that distracts from or detracts from the preaching of the gospel. Ministers are to live in such a way that they can simply call their congregations, as Paul does here, to remembrance. Right? He's not trying to prove something to them through their words that they hadn't already seen in action. He just calls them to remembrance of his past actions toward and among them. So let's look at verses 1 and 2. For yourselves, brethren, know our entrance in unto you, that it was not in vain. But even after we had suffered before, and were shamefully entreated, as you know, at Philippi, we were bold in our God to speak unto you the gospel of God with much contention. And so we looked at Acts 17 last week to see Paul's ministry in Thessalonia, but Acts 16 recounts what happened in Philippi. While in Philippi, Paul threw the city into an uproar, and it led to trouble for him and Silas. It all started because a girl who had a spirit of divination was following him around, proclaiming that he was a minister of the one true God, and Paul was grieved. And that grief led Paul to casting the spirit out of the woman, which really bothered her Roman owners, who made a lot of money on her divination with the townsfolk. And so the owners of this woman grabbed Paul and Silas while they're in Philippi and brought them before the magistrates, complaining that Paul and Silas were stirring up the city because they were Jews, teaching contrary to what would be allowable by Roman law. The things they were teaching were going to make the implications were, you're going to have to disobey the worship due to those in charge in Rome, to the Caesar. The magistrate did not set up a trial. No trial was set up. But they stripped Paul and Silas right on the spot and publicly beat them. And then cast them into prison. And what did Paul and Silas do while in prison? Right, they're in prison. If you read their feet are in stocks. No chance of escaping. So presumably with stinging wounds still open on their backs, unable to sleep with the pain, feet in shackles, they prayed and sang praises unto God. No better time for a psalm sing. And it led to miracles and salvation in the jail. Most notably the guard, who was about to kill himself when he saw that everybody had been loosed from their stocks. Jail doors open, but nobody had left. Their time in prison was well spent in ministry to fellow prisoners and to their guard. I've heard allegedly of some police forces having, in times past, something called a beat and release program, which was more or less, this is something I heard about from older cops. Basically, if you had somebody who committed some kind of lower level misdemeanor, some kind of thing that they probably wouldn't have a court date for anytime soon, or could kind of, if the cop wanted to let them go, he could, kind of thing. Maybe a warrant for their arrest. The cop would give that individual the opportunity to basically receive a whooping in a lumberyard nearby to the jail instead of having to go to jail. So take a beating and then go on your way. Have a good night. Now, our prison system has all kinds of issues. And that's because we're all turned around about what true justice looks like as a nation. And so when you think about our prison system, our jail system, why are people committing property crimes and then being housed for months and months in facilities paid for by taxpayers while victims of such property crimes receive no restitution from the criminals? And time and again, I had to deal with that in San Diego where somebody had all their tires popped by some guy who was really high and loved the sound of air coming out of the tires when he put a knife in it. And there's no restitution for that individual. It's just like, oh, the guy's going to go to jail. Well, I don't really care if he goes to jail. It doesn't help me a lot. My tires are popped. Why are we allowing convicted rapists, child molesters, murderers to live on as if they had not committed such a heinous act against another human? Why are they not dead? So there are certainly crimes for which a beating is far more appropriate and righteous than jail time. There is that category. But the righteous piece of that puzzle involves conviction for the crime. There needs to be witnesses and there needs to be a fair trial for the accused. And so the beat and release program falls short in delivering justice because it skips over the trial. It can easily result in a man being punished, being beaten, though uncondemned. Paul and Silas were victims, in one way, of such a program, such a beat and release program, only adding some jail time that was for no purpose other than suffering, that they weren't awaiting a court date. Someone in the city accused them, and before they could make any kind of defense, they were stripped and beaten in front of everyone. No trials whatsoever. The magistrate told a Roman sergeant the next morning, back in Philippi, to release them. It's not like they were awaiting a trial date. It was simply over. But Paul said the magistrate could come themselves and talk with him. A Roman citizen who was publicly made a shameful spectacle without any lawful grounds for such treatment. Paul was not about to be snuck out the back door of the jail after being unlawfully arrested. The magistrates came, begging for him to leave, and he did so. The magistrates were fearful of the consequences of such unjust treatment being exposed, and so they begged Paul to leave the city. Paul having such a vocal presence of righteousness in this city threw the sinners of that city into great turmoil. Right? That's what happened. Paul bringing righteousness, Paul delivering a woman from a spirit of divination and coming to preach the gospel, stirred up the city. And leave a city undisturbed in its sin, leave a town undisturbed in its sin, and oftentimes they will all carry on with their wickedness with what looks like great peace. Bring a preacher into the city, bring a righteousness that's lived out publicly, and watch the wicked gnash their teeth. Preach the gospel where unbelievers are present. We've experienced plenty of this. and be mocked and scoffed at. Be ready for lots of middle fingers. And those who call themselves Christians being distraught by your preaching against sin. So publicly. The facade of a peaceful world will remain as long as darkness is tolerated, and as long as the word of God, which brings with it great light, is not preached. So before departing to Thessalonia, Paul and Silas went to Lydia's house. We're going to this in Acts 16 again. To meet with the Christians in Philippi and encourage them. And it is important to understand what happened in Philippi with Paul and with Silas, and how Paul responded, because it helps to establish a pattern of how Paul responded in all of his circumstances. Paul leaves a situation of being treated shamefully in Philippi, and he is not deterred from his mission in the least. Paul doesn't even need the travel time to Thessalonia to get his head back in the game. He wasn't discouraged at all. What was the last thing he did before leaving Philippi? He comforted the brethren. So Acts 16 says he goes to Lydia's house, the Christians are gathered there, and he comforts the brethren. Paul counted it all joy. Suffering for Christ was a given, an expectation. So what were they going to do as they were pushed out of another city? As they were pushed out of Philippi, begged by the magistrates to leave the city, what were they to do? Well, Paul was going to obey. He was going to obey Jesus. His focus went immediately to comforting the Christians he had seen come to faith in that city, and he was going to the next town. Bold in God to preach the gospel of God. Bold in God to preach the gospel of God. So Paul came to Thessalonia, built up in Christ. God had worked great miracles in Philippi. He wasn't focused on the suffering that he experienced. He was focused on and grateful for the fruit he saw born by the Spirit of God in that city. God had blessed many with salvation. So yes, Philippi had some gnarly moments. Some gnarly moments, moments of pain and injustice and frustration, but God worked mightily, and so Paul counted it a privilege. He came to the next city trusting God, and again, not deterred by contention. He expected contention. He was not deterred by it. Paul met the contention in Thessalonia with boldness. He knew it was coming, so he came with boldness and remained there until he and Silas had to be snuck out by the Christians that had been converted there to avoid the mobs. At this point, Paul knew that what he was getting himself into. Anytime he came to a new city, a new set of Jews who hated the gospel of God, he knew that God would save some, and some would become even more bitter enemies. But because of Paul's love for God and his love for those to whom he came preaching, he continued to bring the gospel to each of these cities. Whenever we have the opportunity to preach the word of God, to bring forth the word of God, we ought to do so with boldness. Our ability or our inability to do so with boldness shows often where our hearts are at. Can we stand firmly on the truth of God? Does our approach to it, our delivery to it, change when there's something on the line for us? Is there something we leave out? Something we're softer on? Paul gloried in such truth. And it brought it to many at a great cost to himself. He did not come to the Thessalonians in vain. Wasn't me. But with boldness in Christ. Probably Alex.
You're sure, Alex.
Now, it's worth noting how much earlier so many of us would have given up. It's worth noting how much earlier so many of us would have given up. Paul had all the reasons in the world to quit, all the reasons to hang it up, or at least to bemoan his circumstances. And we don't read any of that. We don't see any of that. We don't see him leaving time for any of that. Falsely imprison the guy after an unjust stripping and flogging in the city square, and he sings in the stocks. Let him go, and he goes right back to the Christians of the town to encourage them. Beg him to leave, and he will go preach to the next city. He does not allow his circumstances to throw him into a mood. He does not go around complaining and wanting people to feel sorry for him. All we see him doing is getting after it. All we see Paul doing is preaching the gospel, working his butt off, and then praying anxiously for all the churches that he has a hand in. He is a man of contentment, a man of hard work, and a man of love. So we have to be people of contentment, of hard work, and of love. Verse 3. For our exhortation was not of deceit, nor of uncleanness, nor in guile. Paul says that the Thessalonians can look at the way that Paul conducted himself among them, And they will see that his ministry was not marked by any of the common pitfalls seen in the lives of many ministers who fail in the discharge of their duties. Paul says first, his exhortation was not of deceit. He did not teach them false doctrine, but he presented them with the pure water of the gospel. His teaching was honoring to Christ, true to his word. Paul says his exhortation was not of uncleanness. Paul had no aim toward uncleanness for himself or for his hearers in his teaching, and I believe this uncleanness is of a sexual nature. Paul uses the same term in Romans 1:24, the term uncleanness, when referring to God giving sinners over in the lusts of their hearts, dishonoring their bodies among themselves. Uncleanness is later used in this same letter, 1 Thessalonians 4, verse 17, in a sexual manner. So Paul was not preaching among them for the purpose of scoring a girl. Now, if you're out there preaching the gospel, and some girl just loves what she hears and works out, following the train of John Knox. God bless you, David. But there are many men in pulpits who have far too much affinity for time alone with the women in their congregations. And this does not offer anything but danger and eventually destruction. Making room for such foolishness, or allowing such a dynamic to develop in a church, or certainly working towards that end, maliciously, is a sure way to tear down a ministry along with many families. People sometimes think of safeguards as only for weak believers. Safeguards are for weak believers. Not everyone needs them. And certainly some brothers and sisters will need additional things than others, additional safeguards. An example would be website blockers on a computer. That can be super helpful for somebody struggling with pornography use, and it ought to be utilized. Cut off your arm. Better to lose your arm than to go to hell with both of them. So we should utilize that. But at the same time, there are baseline safeguards that we all need. We need them, and we need them precisely because we are weak. Right? On one level, we all are weak Christians, weak believers. We're not strong enough, and we shouldn't think of ourselves as strong. We need them precisely because we are weak, and pride here will lead to many more sins. And so safeguards are good and right and necessary. Pastors do not need to be meeting one-on-one with women in their congregation for counseling or for anything else. The pastor's wife should be present, or another officer in the church, but never just the pastor, and a woman, not his wife, in the congregation. Paul's aim was not for sexual immorality. He wasn't angling for that in the least, but edification of the body. And his exhortation was not in guile. He did not come to trick them, to spin doctrines of the Bible to serve himself. Paul came preaching with clarity and with boldness the true gospel. The gospel, as he says, of God. Verse 4. But as we were allowed of God to be put in trust with the gospel, even so we speak, not as pleasing men, but God, which trieth our hearts. Paul saw his ministry as a gift to him from God. His ability to do this thing was a gift to him from God, something he was given the privilege of doing. And so Paul sought to speak in light of such a reality. He didn't come to this by his own strength. He didn't make it up himself. God gave it to him. And so he is responsible to God primarily for how he stewards that gift. The gospel is not from or of man, but is the gospel of God. Paul was trusted by God to bring the gospel everywhere he went, and to do so with boldness. Paul was to go forth into these cities, not seeking to please those to whom he preached, which is often the temptation for a preacher. Tickle the ears. Tell people what they want to hear, but he sought to please God, which means he preached the word of God. If you want to please God in your preaching and your sharing of the gospel, then just stick to the Bible. Where you start to divert in an effort to hedge your bets, keep people from being angry with you, those are the times that you're straying into pleasing men rather than pleasing God. God has saved us, and God has entrusted us with the gospel. And this means that our lives are to be spent in seeking to please God, the one who's freely saved us. This we strive to do as Paul did, knowing that God alone tries our hearts. And so it's pretty foolish to look anywhere else, to think we can please anyone else and it mean anything to God. Only God can try our hearts. No man can try your heart, which means he cannot know your motives. Because he can't try your heart, he can't know your motives, nor can he judge you in light of your motives. He doesn't know them. God, on the other hand, can and does both. God sees our hearts for what they really are. No hiding that from him. And God also judges us in light of the state of our hearts. Words of adoration, words of praise, mean nothing if our heart is far from God. So our preaching and our service is to be conducted to God with an eye toward pleasing him. With an eye toward pleasing him. We could have the whole world against us. Paul certainly had many cities in which he went to where he was the most wanted man. The world can be against us, but if we are serving God, then we have much cause for rejoicing. If we're serving God, we have much cause for rejoicing. We have him for eternity. The praises and approval of men are here today and gone tomorrow. We give them far too much weight. We should count all our blessings as gifts from God, blessings he expects us to steward well. And we ought to use them to please him. Verse 5. For neither at any time used we flattering words, as ye know, nor a cloak of covetousness, God is witness, nor of men sought we glory, neither of you, nor yet of others, when we might have been burdensome as the apostles of Christ. So Paul's confidence in the nature of his ministry is clear. And so he calls God as a witness. He's confident as to the way he's conducted himself, in his actions and in his heart, towards the Thessalonians. And it's interesting to note that Paul covers the main sins to be found among the shepherds of Christ's church. He has already mentioned uncleanness, sexual immorality, and next he mentions his abstinence from words of flattery. He refused to use words of flattery with the Thessalonians. Paul refused to gain good favor with the Thessalonians through false praises and empty compliments. What good is a preacher of God's word? What good is a preacher of God's word if he refuses to bring the counsel of God to bear in the lives of those to whom he's preaching? What good is that? Where is the love for his sheep? True love would mean faithful preaching. True love for the flock would mean that there would be occasions in which hard words would need to be spoken. And a flatterer in that moment will refuse, because he's all caught up in the praises of men. There's no room for flattery among ministers of God. It's an easy way to have the approval of a congregation and a great way to allow sins grow in the shadows of people's lives. Not to mention, people will know, you'll always know a minister's lack of genuineness if he goes around puffing people up like that. People just aren't that stupid. So flattery will make a minister, and will make any of us, if we walk as flatterers, to look like vain people, even to the ones that were flattering. It is a great way to puff people up in pride, a great way to build a church with no solid foundation. Love requires truth to reign. Something to be said for how things are communicated, but flattery has no place. It's off the table. Paul says his ministry among the Thessalonians was void of any cloak of covetousness. Not even a cloak of covetousness. His purposes for coming to them was not to make a quick buck. And he saw to it, really, by the way he lived, right, supporting himself, that was pretty much completely off the table. That charge was completely off the table. He wasn't there to make a quick buck, but to spend himself for the good of those who would hear him in that city. And obviously the prosperity gospel presents itself clearly as a ministry designed toward the financial benefit of preachers. And it's disgusting. It's very clear, very simple, straightforward. Most of us see it plainly. But many more pastors live more modest lives that are full of covetousness. Full of covetousness. They covet easy work weeks that only involve preparing a sermon on Sunday morning and nothing else. They care nothing for their people Monday through Saturday. They love their cozy lifestyle, and they know nothing of sacrifice for their people. Some of you guys probably heard this as well, something on Cross Politics, one of their things. But it was a pastor in Canada talking about the multitude of ministers that he had talked to. So this was a pastor in Canada talking about all these pastors he'd talked to in Canada who were biblically convinced that they ought to have their churches open. Biblically convinced that their churches should be open for services on the Lord's Day. And we're not opening their doors because of pensions, retirement accounts. These pastors were literally refusing to obey Jesus. Refusing to obey Jesus, and doing so for the purpose of being comfortable as their bodies waste away on this earth. Better make sure I'm comfortable when I'm 70 and 80. Love of money is a great snare. A great snare. And many pastors live there. Paul says he did not seek, we read, glory from the Thessalonians or others. Paul is speaking here of financial gain, payment. And he says that he did not want to be burdensome to the Thessalonians. He mentions that he had the right to ask for payment as an apostle of Christ. That was his right. But his desire was to not be a burden. And that was his greater concern. He cared more about taking that chip off the table, blessing them to not have to pay him, and taking that chip of him being charged with covetousness off the table. So though Paul had the right of payment, he wanted to do everything in his power to pay his own way and not burden the Thessalonians. This is objectively a glorious thing. Which is why Paul chose not to use his privilege of getting paid by the church. Now, church members should delight to provide financially for their pastors who sow unto them spiritual things. That should be a delight unto a congregation. But it is a great blessing when a pastor is able to make money elsewhere. It's a great blessing. And so, please pray that God blesses me and David in our work in such a way that we can more faithfully fall into this category over time, more fully. And may the Lord give us wisdom to use our finances well. And we'll talk more about finances here shortly as Paul comes back to it. Verse 7, but we were gentle among you, even as a nurse cherisheth her children. So being affectionately desirous of you, we were willing to have imparted unto you not the gospel of God only, but also our own souls, because ye were dear unto us. Paul's ministry was not one of preaching and then taking off. You see him for a couple hours on Sunday morning. I mean, for Paul, he'd be preaching in the night and then preach till the sun came up again. So even his preaching wouldn't allow you to see him for just a moment. But he wasn't, so to speak, preaching and then taking off. Not to be bothered by the mundane needs of those to whom he preached. Quite the opposite. Paul compares his ministry among them as one of a mother with a nursing child. So Paul picks an example that should make us think of the most tender and affectionate love. Paul, who did not hesitate when necessary to come with strong words, says that his ministry among the Thessalonians was gentle. It was gentle. A minister of the gospel cannot be one speed. A minister of the gospel cannot be one speed, but must be able to hear his people and give them what they need. Paul was not going around crushing bruised reeds, snuffing out smoldering wicks. Paul was building up his church in love, meeting these believers where they were and feeding them as a good shepherd. Paul had an eye in all things toward the good of those believers. He was not concerned with his own gain, and he labored in multiple categories, but desired to give his own soul to these believers in service to them. He preached truth unto them. He walked with them in gentleness, and he gave greatly of himself. If we truly desire lives spent in service to God, they will be marked. It's unavoidable. If you want to fall under that category, living a life in service to God, it'll be a life marked by giving of ourselves in service to others. We have to be willing to give ourselves in service to others, and we have to be willing to speak the truth. Truth is plain. We just need to actually walk in it. And walking alongside people is not easy. It's not easy. It requires patience. We have to be patient. It requires diligence. It requires commitment to loving others even when the day has already worn you out. Paul gave of his soul. He left it all on the field for the Thessalonians. Verse 9. For ye remember, brethren, our labor and travail, for laboring night and day, because we would not be chargeable unto any of you, we preached unto you the gospel of God. Again, the proof of Paul's ministry was in the pudding. He wasn't asking the Thessalonians to call over to another church for confirmation, figure out what he's about. Paul was speaking of his work among them. He had proven it to them. They saw how Paul worked, and so he just calls them to remember. Paul worked hard, and he preached to them the gospel of God. In his evaluation of what to cut out of his life, it was most likely sleep, because he's laboring here day and night. His work, we know he provided for himself, but we know his work didn't bar him from preaching the gospel. He was a shepherd unto them, and so he did both. He found time for both. He labored night and day. His work, building tents, simply allowed him to preach free of charge. Again, it is a glorious thing for a minister to be able to work outside of the church and not be a burden on a church financially. And this is not to say that ministers should not get paid or that it's wrong, but it is glorious for Paul to forsake what was his right as a minister, a right to be paid for his ministering, for the good of the body. And that's why he did it. Not only does it free church members, on one level, from bitterness towards one who may be getting paid by the church, but it frees the church up to use this money for other endeavors. Now, last year, Dave and I talked with a brother who's an elder, not a pastor, because they're Presbyterian. Although you listen to the guy talking, he sounds like a pastor. But he's an elder in a church in Lewiston, Idaho, which is south of Moscow. And because they don't have a pastor right now, they have I think they had 3 elders, or at least 3 elders who were rotating on preaching. And they all had full-time jobs, and so none of them were taking anything from the church for a payment. And so the church was able to do amazing things in their community. Their church, I don't know how much outside help they have, how much fundraising they did, but I know a lot of it was just from their tithing, was starting a school. They purchased a building, they were starting a school, and they had, I think, established, minimally bolstered a life clinic in town. A pro-life clinic that was, they hooked them up with a few ultrasound machines and all these things. They were able to do this because they weren't having to pay a pastor. That's objectively, that's just a glorious thing. It's a glorious thing. And from another perspective, the blessing comes to the minister as well. Wrong desires toward flattery will come more and more as the money comes in. And that's whether it's getting paid or not. Just seeing a church established, wanting a building. Now you got more bills to pay as a church. Flattery becomes more and more enticing as there's more on the line. Don't want to offend a big donor. A pastor that lets that mindset set in will quickly become a slave to the approval of men and will fear a dip in the church budget more than he fears God. The gospel of God, as Paul puts it, that's the term he uses in our text. The gospel of God is a glorious phrase. It is the gospel of Jesus Christ. It's one and the same gospel. It is the gospel of God. God the Father, in his love, sent the Son. The Son willingly took on flesh to redeem a people for himself and accomplish that redemption perfectly. And the Spirit of God applies that work to each of our hearts, to the heart of every single believer, and preserves us to the end. And so it is the gospel of the triune God. Verse 10, ye are witnesses, speaking to the Thessalonians, and God also, how holily and justly and unblameably we behaved ourselves among you that believe. Paul again calls his audience, the Thessalonians, to witness for him. And he calls on God as well, and declares that he and his companions had exemplary behavior among the believers in Thessalonia. These were 3 glorious weeks of ministry between Paul and the Thessalonians. He worked tirelessly for their benefit, and it apparently bore great fruit when you look at the reputation of the Thessalonian church. Right? They're known throughout all of Greece and beyond for their love, for their work of faith. Paul walked in holiness. He ministered justly, and he left no room for charges to be brought against him. And that is lawfully. Ministers will always be slandered. Paul met with slander left and right. There's no way to walk in such a way as to avoid being slandered. How could you prevent a sleazy enemy from lying about you? What Paul did, and what all ministers must do, is walk blamelessly. They must walk blamelessly. Before God, ministers are to walk in such a way that any charge of injustice, a charge of unholiness, is slanderous. It's a lie. In verses 11 and 12. As ye know how we exhorted and comforted and charged every one of you, as a father doth his children. So first Paul compares himself to a mother, now to a father with his children. That ye would walk worthy of God, who hath called you unto his kingdom and glory. So Paul again compares himself to a father in his ministry to the Thessalonians. In some ways, ministers are to be like nursing mothers, and in other ways, they're to be like fathers with their children. Paul saw himself as a father with his children, these new believers. And this fatherhood was marked, we read, by exhortations, by comforts, and by charges. Pastors are to train up their flock in the way they should go, like a father doth his children. They're to teach them the truths of God, what it looks like, what it means to walk in them, when they're falling short of walking in them. Pastors, like fathers, should be calling out sin, bringing discipline when necessary, and being a main source of encouragement for his people. Paul then mentions his main exhortation and charge to this church, his main desire and longing for them as a body. What was Paul's goal for the Thessalonians? He wanted them to walk worthy of God. He wanted them to walk worthy of God. Now, in and of themselves, these Thessalonians did not have the slightest ability to walk worthy of God. How can any sinner walk worthy of God? These Thessalonians are called believers because Paul brought them the gospel of God, which is a gospel of grace, and they had faith in the Savior presented in that gospel. The Thessalonians were saved, as all Christians are, by grace. They were saved because God had mercy on them and gave them ears to hear the gospel. God gave them new hearts that trusted in Jesus. Everything about their salvation was an undeserved gift, completely apart from merit. And so where does the worthiness even enter into the conversation? The gospel unites us to Jesus Christ. We are found in him, worthy of death and yet given eternal life. We only bring damnable sin to the table, but Jesus washes us clean from our sins, clothes us in his own righteousness. Justification means God sees Jesus' work of obedience counted as ours. We are counted worthy of eternal life by grace. We are called into God's kingdom, made partakers of his glory. When we come to God, we come in Christ. That is why the author of Hebrews tells us to approach God's throne with boldness, the throne of grace that we have access to through Jesus. We come to with boldness and confidence through our faith in Jesus. Through our faith in Jesus. We don't come bemoaning our unworthiness, though we know we are unworthy. We come united to Jesus, and so we come with perfect righteousness. Coming boldly honors the work of Christ on our behalf. That's why we come boldly. What has Jesus purchased? And what are you saying about what Jesus purchased in the way you approach God? In the way you walk after him? Coming boldly honors the work of Christ on our behalf. Coming to God boldly testifies to the magnitude of Jesus' work. And when we live for God, we live in Christ, and so we walk worthy. We walk as one justified before God and freed to obey his law. And obey his law we ought. You can't simply be in Christ and refuse to obey God's law and consider yourself to be walking worthy of him. We're justified before God, and so we walk as one justified before God and free to obey his law. We have a high and holy calling, and we walk worthy of it by faith. If we're to walk worthy of it, we walk worthy of it by faith. Let's pray.